when you really start thinking about it, people think, well, gee, you know, the theory of evolution is a Johnny-come-lately theory. But we have had the concept of change, gradual change in species for longer than we've understood that germs cause disease, and for longer than we've understood the idea that matter is subdivided into units that we call atoms. So, interesting perspective. With that, let me introduce our three speakers. The first speaker tonight is going to be Paul Decelles, and Paul is on the faculty here at Johnson County Community College. His training is in entomology and evolutionary biology, appropriate for his speaking tonight. He has a PhD from the University of Kansas. Aside from biology, his interests include the relationship between science and religion, also appropriate for this evening's presentation. He also serves on the board of Kansas Citizens for Science and runs several blogs, including a science blog at the Lawrence Journal World called Dangerous Ideas. And this evening, Paul's topic will be some myths and misconceptions about evolution. The second, and Paul, did you raise your hand? Okay, there we go. So Paul will be our first speaker. Our second speaker will be Josh Rosenau, and so it sounds like he has a following already. That's not surprising, because he has the blog, and has had before he moved away, called Thoughts from Kansas. And he is currently on the staff at the National Center for Science Education, and is in charge of public information programs. Public Information Program Director. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So he has an official title, but we enjoy the fact that he blogs about our activities back here. Our final speaker for this evening will be Dave Burress, who is a retired economics professor from KU, was a founding board member for Kansas Citizens for Science, and is on the board of Ad Astra, which is a progressive Kansas policy think tank. Without any further ado, we'll ask Paul to come up and share with us. Paul Decelles.
Well, actually, I decided to title my talk, Evolution, What People Don't Get. And, you know, as a person, I've been interested in biology for most of my life. I got my first microscope when I think when I was 7 or something like that. And I remember being really disappointed because I couldn't see bacteria with my little Gilbert microscope. And so by the time, you know, I was in high school, I had probably checked out the classic zoology text, The Animals Without Backbones, at least 100 times. And you know, for me, religion really wasn't that big of an issue in terms of thinking about evolution. I happen to be a Roman Catholic, maybe not the best one in the world, according to some people, but that is my theological tradition. And Catholics tend to be pretty accepting about evolution, and I think that's because we don't have the same literal understanding of the Bible that certain groups in this country have. For us, the fact that the Bible is not to be taken literal was settled by St. Augustine. End of story. That's all I'm going to say about religion tonight, quite frankly. Okay. The other thing, so, you know, my concern as an educator is not so much about getting people to accept evolution. You know, we tend to focus on these polls that say 50% of the people in the country don't believe that we descended from apes or something like that. And I'm more concerned that people understand evolution, okay? We used to have, strangely enough, a creationist instructor. Oh, cameras, I don't like talking in front of people. I like talking in front of people. Okay, we had a creationist instructor as an adjunct. And students shop around for instructors that they're comfortable with. Well, he decided to go on to greener pastures or something like that, and I inherited his class. And they had heard about me, and you should have seen the crestfallen faces. But we got along fine. You know, I simply told them, listen, if you're going to not believe in something, you better understand what it is you don't believe in. Okay? And then I said, just think about it as knowing your enemy if you want. And we got along fine, and some of them did quite well. But I've always been puzzled at the sorts of misconceptions that people have about evolution, and I began really thinking about this after encountering several papers that claimed that natural selection is in some way counterintuitive. Because to me, natural selection is very intuitive, but in thinking about my student responses and how questions that students ask me, including this semester, you know, I've come to realize more and more that no, natural selection is not is indeed counterintuitive for many people. And there are lots of misconceptions about evolution and natural selection, and it's hard to know, quite frankly, what to pick. Fortunately, a lot of the heavy lifting has been done for me by a fellow by the name of T.R. Gregory, who wrote in a journal called Evolution Education. Our paper just came out in 2009, and he's very nicely categorized some of the major misconceptions that people have focusing on natural selection, but they also apply, obviously, in general to evolution as a whole. And so my talk, what people don't get. And if you're not familiar with what's here, obviously I have an ant, and those of you here might realize that these are little aphids, and this ant is collecting honeydew from these aphids. And there's actually a little co-evolutionary relationship going on here. So we've got the food plant for the aphids and the ant all in one slide. Okay. The first big misconception about evolution, and I get this all the time from my students, is that natural selection is the same thing as evolution. And I can understand where that idea comes from, because after all, that's what Darwin emphasized as the mechanism for adaptation. But we understand, and have understood for a long time, that there are at least 4 other mechanisms involved in the evolutionary process. For example, there's a process called genetic drift, which is kind of a chance sampling of populations that's critical when populations are small. There's gene flow, migration between different populations, and various types of non-random mating, and of course mutation. But natural selection occupies a special place because along with mutation, that's the process by which new adaptations arise and how complexity develops in the living world. Okay. So what is natural selection? Oh, I'm cued for the next slide. Oops. So what is natural selection? Gregory, in the paper that I mentioned earlier, has a nice compilation of the various definitions that scientists have given for natural selection. And some of them may be correct, but they're hopelessly abstract. For example, my favorite, and I know what these people are getting at, is from Stearns and Hoekstra, which Gregory quotes as defining natural selection as the correlation of a trait with reproductive success. And you know, that gets at really the germ of the idea, but maybe in a way that's not very exciting for students and the general reader. Gregory gives a very nice summary of the inferences and observations that Darwin made that led him to impart his idea for natural selection. And you start out with a series of observations, many of which you're familiar with. For example, the idea that populations have the potential to outstrip their environment. They tend to increase exponentially when resources are abundant. Populations generally remain stable once they reach a certain size. Well, we know that's not necessarily true, but we'll put up with that. And then natural resources are limited, which is something that our species seems to be in a state of denial about. Then